Millions watched the Commonwealth speech for diplomacy, unity, and tradition. But palace watchers weren't listening. They were staring at her wrist. One small piece of jewelry appeared where protocol normally forbids improvisation. It wasn't new, it wasn't random, and it wasn't neutral. Within minutes, private phone calls began inside royal residences because someone realized this was not fashion. It was communication. State occasions inside the monarchy operate with a precision closer to ceremony than choice. Nothing worn during a major address exists by accident. Weeks before the speech, wardrobe selections would have been reviewed, adjusted, and quietly approved by multiple layers of private secretaries and advisors whose role is not style but stability. The monarchy does not allow spontaneous symbolism during moments meant to represent continuity. Jewelry, especially, is treated as language, and language cannot be improvised when the crown is speaking to the world. That is why the bracelet unsettled them. It did not belong to the shared vault. It was not one of the neutral heirlooms rotated safely between royal women. It was personal, specifically personal. The kind of piece usually kept outside official rotation because its meaning is too precise, too emotional, too remembered. Some objects carry history. Others carry unfinished conversations. The reaction inside palace circles came quickly and quietly. Aides who normally focus on speeches shifted attention to implications. Calls were made not to stylists, but to senior households, not to ask what it was, they already knew, but to confirm that it had truly been chosen. Because choosing it during an international unity address transformed the bracelet from remembrance into statement. Hours later, the public would notice and debate sentiment. Inside the institution, the interpretation moved faster and sharper. Tribute suggests affection. A signal suggests intention. Royal culture has always depended on that distinction. One comforts the past, the other alters the present. And timing made it impossible to dismiss. The Commonwealth speech represents continuity between monarch, heirs, and future leadership. Wearing a personal relic tied to a figure whose legacy reshaped public expectations introduced a second narrative into a moment meant to be singular. Not disruption, but something more delicate. A reminder. A positioning. Perhaps even a quiet declaration about emotional authority within a structured hierarchy. The palace would never acknowledge such language publicly. Yet those who live within it understand that objects can speak when words must remain disciplined. A bracelet cannot interrupt a speech, cannot challenge protocol openly, cannot create confrontation. But it can redirect attention, and sometimes attention is power. So the real question was never whether it was appropriate. The real question was who needed to hear it. But to understand why this tiny object triggered immediate concern, we have to go back to the woman who last wore it, and the rules created after her death. After Diana's death, the monarchy didn't just mourn, it rewrote behavior. Not publicly, not officially, quietly. A set of invisible rules formed around her image, her belongings, and especially her jewelry. Some items became safe tributes, others became restricted symbols, and a small category became emotionally dangerous. The bracelet Kate chose belonged to that last category. Grief alone did not reshape the palace. Public reaction did. The days following her death exposed something the institution had long tried to control. Emotional allegiance could rival constitutional authority. People were not simply mourning a princess. They were comparing her humanity to the monarchy's distance. And inside private meetings, the realization settled heavily. Objects connected to her now carried opinion, memory, and sometimes criticism. The response was subtle but deliberate. No announcements, no written policies. Instead, habits changed. Certain jewels were circulated freely, becoming neutral tokens of remembrance. Others quietly disappeared from official rotations. The difference was not value or beauty, it was meaning. A necklace might recall elegance. A ring might recall compassion. But some pieces recalled conflict. Conversations the palace preferred history to soften. Inheritance complicated everything. Legally, personal belongings passed to her sons. Symbolically, they belonged to the crown's narrative. Ownership gave the right to possess, but not always the freedom to present. Wearing a piece publicly could reopen chapters the institution worked carefully to close. So, a balance formed, memory acknowledged, but memory contained. Senior figures understood the emotional terrain better than anyone outside could. They had lived through the fractures, the press storms, the internal disagreements never spoken openly. To them, jewelry was no longer decoration. It was alignment. A selection could suggest admiration, but it could also imply continuation of a perspective. And perspectives had once shaken public trust. Among the women of the family, an unspoken understanding developed. Some pieces were worn warmly, safely, often. Others required quiet consultation. Not permission, exactly, but awareness, a shared instinct to avoid stirring comparisons that would drag the present into unresolved past tension. This wasn't written protocol. It was cultural survival. Over time, the public forgot the boundaries existed. The palace never did, because symbols endure longer than statements. A photograph fades from headlines, but a repeated association becomes legacy. And legacy determines how future roles are perceived long before they are officially assumed. That is why the bracelet mattered. It did not belong to the neutral category of remembrance. It belonged to the emotionally precise category, the one that carried interpretation rather than nostalgia. Wearing it did not just recall Diana. It recalled a particular understanding of her place within the monarchy, which raises a more uncomfortable question. Who actually had authority over Diana's personal jewels? The public assumes inheritance equals freedom. Inside the monarchy, it doesn't. A royal can legally possess something yet still be unable to wear it. Because jewelry in the royal family isn't just property, it's narrative control. And Diana's bracelet carried a story some people believed should remain closed forever. On paper, the matter was simple. Personal items passed to her sons, and with them came custody of memory. But the monarchy does not function on paper alone. It functions on continuity, perception, and carefully protected symbolism. The moment an object enters public view, it stops belonging only to the individual and begins speaking on behalf of the institution. Ownership grants the right to keep it. Visibility grants the power to redefine it. That difference has caused quiet conflict before. There had been occasions when a piece appeared unexpectedly and aides reacted with polite urgency. Not anger, never openly, but concern. A bracelet, a ring, a brooch could reopen associations the palace spent years guiding toward gentler interpretation. Each appearance was weighed not by beauty, but by consequence. Because the monarchy survives by managing emotional memory as carefully as constitutional duty. This particular bracelet was more than affectionate remembrance. It was linked to a chapter of Diana's life that still divides interpretation inside private circles. Some saw compassion and independence, others remembered turbulence and scrutiny. Reintroducing it risked reviving narratives the institution had slowly allowed to fade into respectful distance. The past had been carefully framed. Symbols could rearrange that frame overnight, which is why the choice likely did not happen casually. Wardrobe decisions for a global address pass through layers of preparation, and deviations rarely escape notice. Either conversations occurred in advance, or silence became its own form of approval. In royal culture, permission is often communicated by the absence of objection. Yet absence does not mean comfort. It sometimes means acceptance of an outcome already decided, and that is where intention matters. An accidental tribute invites correction. A deliberate selection invites interpretation. The bracelet was positioned where it could be seen clearly, not hidden within lace or sleeve. That distinction transforms sentiment into message, not rebellion, something quieter and more controlled. A statement delivered within the rules while altering their effect. Those inside the system would understand immediately. This was not nostalgia. It was positioning. The wearer was acknowledging a legacy while defining her relationship to it. Not claiming ownership of the past, but choosing how the past would stand beside the present. Which leaves a lingering tension. If it required awareness, if it carried implication, and if it risked reopening memory, then timing becomes the final piece of meaning. So if permission was complicated, why choose that specific night? The Commonwealth speech wasn't routine. Behind the scenes, it marked a delicate shift in leadership tone and global positioning. Every word had diplomatic meaning, and so did every visual. Royals communicate stability through symbolism, which means introducing a controversial relic during a unity message was either a mistake or a deliberate counter-message. The address came during a moment when the monarchy was redefining how it presented itself to the world. The language of continuity carried more weight than usual, because continuity was no longer automatic. It had to be demonstrated. Generational transition changes not just roles but tone, and tone shapes trust. Those drafting the speech focused on reassurance, cooperation, and calm permanence. But institutions rarely speak through text alone. They speak through presence. Preparation for such an appearance stretches far beyond the script. Wardrobe planning begins weeks in advance, each element selected to avoid distraction. Neutrality is normally the goal. Nothing that provokes speculation. Nothing that competes with the message being delivered. Yet the bracelet sat in open view, not hidden beneath a sleeve, not softened into background detail. Visible enough that anyone trained to read royal signals would recognize it instantly. Observers noticed subtle shifts in posture as the speech unfolded. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but controlled emphasis. The kind that suggests awareness of being carefully watched beyond the audience in front of her. Because the audience was never just the public. It included family residences, private offices, and advisors accustomed to interpreting gestures more than sentences. Inside those spaces, attention moved away from the words themselves. The speech promoted unity across nations, but the object introduced a second narrative running alongside it. Two messages sharing one moment. The official voice spoke about stability. The unspoken one hinted at identity and legacy. Those who understood royal communication would not confuse coincidence with placement. Meanwhile, the wider media discussed diplomacy and tone, unaware that another conversation had already started in quieter corridors. Not alarm. The monarchy avoids visible alarm, but alertness. An understanding that symbolic timing often reveals priorities before announcements ever do. The bracelet did not interrupt the address. It reframed it, gently but unmistakably. And that reframing mattered because symbols operate differently from statements. A statement can be clarified. A symbol must be interpreted, and interpretation travels faster than correction. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once noticed by the right people, it becomes part of the event's meaning, whether acknowledged or not. Because this wasn't the first time clothing had been used to say what couldn't be spoken. Royal women rarely give political interviews. They don't need to. Over decades, a silent vocabulary developed: colors for allegiance, brooches for diplomacy, tiaras for hierarchy. Messages delivered without a single spoken word. And once you understand this language, the bracelet stops looking sentimental and starts reading like a sentence. The monarchy has always relied on restraint. Words invite debate, but symbols invite reflection. A spoken position can be challenged. A carefully chosen emblem lingers in the mind, interpreted rather than argued. Over time, this became a discipline. A certain shade worn during a sensitive visit suggested solidarity without negotiation. A specific brooch during a state reception reassured allies while remaining formally neutral. Observers learned to listen not to statements, but to patterns. This method emerged from necessity. The crown must remain above political conversation, yet it still exists within political reality. The solution was expression without declaration, communication disguised as continuity. Every appearance became layered: public ceremony on the surface, private reassurance underneath. Those inside diplomatic circles began paying attention long before the wider public understood the code. Diana understood it instinctively. When she wanted compassion emphasized, she softened formality. When she wanted independence recognized, she altered expectation just enough to provoke conversation without confrontation. She rarely contradicted the institution openly, yet she influenced how it was perceived by shaping the emotional tone surrounding it. Her clothing did not rebel. It redirected. Years later, the same language appeared again, but more controlled. Where Diana disrupted instinctively, this usage felt measured. The bracelet did not announce nostalgia. It referenced a philosophy, a particular relationship between monarchy and public feeling. By selecting a piece loaded with memory rather than neutrality, the wearer acknowledged that emotional connection remains central to modern royal relevance. The palace would have anticipated interpretation from those familiar with precedent. Advisors understand the symbolic vocabulary as well as diplomats do, which means the decision could not have been made assuming it would pass unnoticed. It was meant to be understood, though not publicly decoded. That delicate balance preserves dignity while allowing intention to travel quietly. Of course, symbols carry risk. The public often sees tribute where insiders see positioning. Emotional resonance can overshadow calculated meaning, softening a signal into sentiment. Yet even misinterpretation serves a purpose. It allows the message to exist without formal acknowledgement. The monarchy thrives in that ambiguity, where clarity belongs to those trained to recognize it. So the bracelet functioned less as remembrance and more as reference. A line spoken in a language the institution has used for generations. Not defiance, not imitation, but continuation of a communication method older than any single reign. But symbolism only matters if someone was meant to receive it. The public saw elegance, the press saw nostalgia. But inside the royal network, attention turned toward specific rooms, not television screens. Because messages in monarchy rarely address crowds, they address individuals. And several people connected to Diana would immediately understand what that bracelet meant when worn at that moment. Royal life operates on relationships long before it operates on ceremony. Shared history shapes reactions faster than headlines ever can. Within the family, Diana's legacy was never a single story. To some, it represented emotional openness the institution eventually embraced. To others, it recalled turbulence that forced painful adaptation. Both interpretations lived quietly beside each other for years, balanced by distance and time. The bracelet disturbed that balance not loudly, but precisely. Those who knew the past intimately would not need explanation. The timing aligned with conversations already unfolding privately. discussions about direction, influence, and how the next era of monarchy would feel rather than simply function. In that context, the object became more than remembrance. It became positioning. Reassurance to some that continuity of empathy would remain central. A subtle warning to others that the emotional legacy attached to Diana would not be quietly minimized. Courtiers reacted differently from journalists because their task is not reporting, but interpretation. They track patterns. They remember precedents. When no clarification followed the appearance, they understood immediately. Ambiguity was intentional. In royal communication, explanation reduces impact. Silence strengthens it. By refusing to define the meaning, the palace allowed each informed observer to reach the same conclusion independently. The absence of comment mattered more than any statement could have. If the bracelet had been accidental, correction would have come swiftly and gently. Instead, the moment was allowed to settle. That settling transformed speculation into recognition. Not confrontation, not defiance, acknowledgement. A message delivered without challenging hierarchy, yet impossible to ignore within it. For those emotionally tied to Diana's place in the monarchy, the signal landed with weight. It suggested continuity of her influence through relationship rather than comparison. Not replacing anyone, not revisiting conflict, but quietly affirming that her role in shaping public connection remained relevant to the institution's future identity. And because the message was private in nature, public debate could neither confirm nor cancel it. The monarchy preserved dignity while communicating intent. A balance perfected over generations. Speak clearly to the few while appearing neutral to the many. And that silence created a ripple effect the next morning. No correction was issued. No clarification offered. Normally, ambiguous royal moments get gently reframed by aides within hours. This time, nothing, which transformed a quiet observation into a deliberate act. Because in monarchy protocol, refusing to explain is sometimes the explanation. In the hours after the speech, reporters waited for the familiar pattern. A brief line from a spokesperson. A soft adjustment of narrative. Something small to guide interpretation back toward harmless tribute. Instead, the press office held its ground in silence. Calls were answered politely, but carefully. Questions acknowledged without resolution. The absence felt intentional, and intention is never accidental within an institution built on message control. Inside the palace system, quiet movement replaced public comment. Background conversations began shaping understanding without appearing to do so. Certain correspondence received gentle context, not confirmation, just enough to encourage a particular reading while preserving deniability. It was a method refined over decades. Guide the story without owning it. Let observers reach the conclusion themselves, then never contradict it. As the morning progressed, attention shifted. The speech itself, designed to emphasize unity and continuity, began sharing space with speculation about symbolism. Analysts dissected tone, posture, timing, yet the bracelet overshadowed the prepared words. Not because it glittered, but because it suggested meaning beyond the official message. The institution had spoken carefully, and the audience realized something else had spoken louder. Public reaction carried emotion. Many saw affection, a respectful connection across generations. The palace, however, evaluates reaction differently. Popular warmth is welcome, but unpredictability is not. The challenge has always been balancing human connection with controlled stability. Allowing the narrative to grow unchecked risked reviving comparisons the monarchy historically preferred, softened by time. Yet denying it outright would amplify it further. Senior figures chose restraint. Not endorsement, not correction, endurance. Experience had taught them that overreaction creates headlines, while patience reshapes them. The silence became strategy, letting the moment settle into accepted interpretation rather than contested controversy. Gradually, the conversation shifted from shock to implication, and implication carries power. Observers began linking the appearance to a broader transition. Not a sudden change, but a subtle repositioning of emotional identity within the royal structure. The bracelet ceased to be an isolated gesture and became part of a developing narrative about continuity through personality rather than tradition alone. By now, the question had changed from "why did she wear it?" to "what does this mean for the future?" For decades, Diana represented an alternative vision of monarchy: personal, emotional, and modern. Wearing her bracelet during a global address wasn't backward-looking nostalgia. It suggested continuity of influence, not replacing the institution, but reshaping it quietly from within. The monarchy has always depended on distance to survive. Ceremony creates respect, and respect sustains authority. Yet Diana changed the equation by adding connection. She did not dismantle tradition. She altered how people felt about it. The crown remained formal, but it began to feel reachable. That emotional shift lingered long after her lifetime, waiting for someone who could acknowledge it without reopening the tensions that followed her rise. The bracelet became that acknowledgement. Not a revival of old conflict, but a careful bridge between two eras. Instead of confronting the past, it absorbed it, allowing memory to sit beside present duty without competition. The gesture implied that compassion was no longer an external influence on the monarchy. It was becoming part of its identity. Public reaction revealed why this mattered. Many did not analyze protocol or symbolism. They simply felt continuity. Familiar warmth inside an institution, often viewed as distant. That emotional recognition transferred legacy from one generation to the next without announcement. No speeches about modernizing were necessary. The message lived inside the association itself. Authority within monarchy traditionally flows from title downward, but emotional authority flows upward, granted by public trust. By invoking a figure whose power came from empathy rather than hierarchy, the wearer aligned herself with that second form of influence. It suggested leadership not only through position, but through understanding, a quieter, more durable strength. At the same time, the institution avoided admitting transformation outright. Adaptation in monarchy rarely arrives declared. It arrives embodied. Gradually, the public accepts change because it feels familiar rather than disruptive. The bracelet functioned as endorsement across time, a recognition that the future could carry forward the emotional resonance once considered outside formal tradition. In that sense, the object stopped belonging solely to the past. It became a signpost pointing forward, a reassurance that evolution could occur without fracture, continuity without repetition. The monarchy did not abandon its structure. It softened its expression. And that leads to the final realization. The bracelet was never about Diana alone. In royal life, statements are rarely spoken plainly. Instead, they're placed carefully where cameras cannot ignore them. The Commonwealth speech wasn't interrupted. No declaration was made. Yet a message traveled across households, courtiers, and generations, a message about identity, authority, and who defines the monarchy's emotional center going forward. By the time the moment settled, interpretation no longer depended on speculation. The bracelet had performed a role usually reserved for formal milestones. It acknowledged inheritance without ceremony. Not inheritance of jewels, but inheritance of expectation. The expectation that the monarchy must feel understood to remain accepted. That understanding once reshaped public perception dramatically, and now it had been quietly claimed rather than dramatically announced. For the public, familiarity emerged first. People did not debate constitutional theory. They recognized continuity of feeling. The association reassured them that the institution they watched evolving still carried emotional memory within it. Stability was not presented as rigid permanence, but as recognizable humanity. Without a speech explaining it, the connection had already been made. Inside the institution, the meaning carried different weight. Continuity had been signaled without provoking confrontation. No titles referenced, no comparisons drawn, no history reopened. Yet the implication existed. The emotional identity once orbiting outside formal authority now stood beside it. The future could incorporate what once challenged it. The message was firm precisely because it avoided argument. Timing amplified the effect. Moments preceding larger responsibilities often invite reassurance, both internally and publicly. Rather than promise direction through words that could bind future decisions, the signal offered orientation, a sense of how leadership would feel rather than how it would rule. Subtlety preserved flexibility while establishing expectation. That subtlety explains the palace response. They did not confirm meaning because confirmation narrows interpretation. They did not deny it because denial fractures trust. Allowing the symbol to live independently granted it durability. Observers reached the conclusion themselves, and conclusions reached privately resist contradiction more than official statements ever could. In the end, the bracelet did what speeches rarely achieve. It aligned memory, emotion, and authority without debate. It accepted a legacy without repeating it, and suggested continuity without demanding attention. The monarchy spoke softly, yet everyone who needed to hear it understood. Because sometimes the most powerful royal statement isn't spoken in a speech. It's worn on a wrist.